Welcome to Grief is the New Normal. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, a licensed psychologist and grief specialist, here to help change the conversation about grief and build community and connection while we all adjust to this new normal we are living in. This podcast is for you if you are grieving or if you are supporting someone in a season of grief. I'm glad you're here. Hey, grief community. I was recently at the Innovations in Psychotherapy Conference in Anaheim and felt incredibly inspired after listening to Deb Dana share about polyvagal theory. I realized that might sound woo-woo or like bigger language than maybe you want to dig into, but I think it gives us a really beautiful framework for understanding grief. I'd like to add an addendum to episode 3. I realized that was about 30 episodes ago, and I think it's important to update information as it becomes more pertinent. Here is that addendum to episode 3. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Let's dig into today. As we talked about on our very first episode, grief is a universal lived experience, and it's frustrating how in a society where we all experience grief in different ways, we're still in a grief society. It's often very misunderstood. It's confusing, it's overwhelming, it's uncomfortable. It would be way more comfortable if it followed a natural progression, right? If there was some logical pattern to grief or some predictability to it, because when we're in those grief states, it feels like nothing's in our control. I think as humans, we so want to make meaning from things. And if something seems close enough, we'll try to make that work. We'll try to make that fit, even if it's not a perfect fit. And I think that's maybe what happened with adapting the 5 stages of grief, not just to a terminal diagnosis, but to all types of grief. So for those of us who have lived through loss, we know that grief is not a linear process. It comes in waves or in cycles, ins and outs, maybe even a roller coaster with ups and downs, loops and twists, no clear beginning. Traditionally, grief has been viewed through the lens of stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. We're all familiar with them. You Google grief, that's what pops up. However, these stages were initially meant for those grappling with a terminal illness diagnosis, and they don't adequately describe the non-linear experiences of those left behind to mourn. There is nothing linear about grief. There are no stages. It is a myth. It is trying to create something that has a predictable beginning, middle, and end. And because grief is painful, complicated, confusing, and disorienting, and changing the landscape of our brains, we desperately want something predictable, especially when dealing with a life event we didn't choose. It was something out of our control. Instead, I would love to present the idea of understanding grief states, emotion states, and utilizing the perspective of our nervous system through Deb Dana's polyvagal theory to talk about how our bodies physically manifest grief. I think this approach breaks down the binary of old grief models and introduces a spectrum of states that more accurately reflect our lived experiences. When we think about the polyvagal theory, we're thinking about a ladder, a 3-pronged ladder. On the top state, you have the ventral vagal system, and this is where we're feeling connected, we're feeling social, we are our most adult selves, we are creative, we're functioning. And then you move down to the middle level, and that's sympathetic activation, or the sympathetic level. Here, our body ramps up into a state of high alert. This is where feelings of anxiety, panic, or even anger can surface. It's like an alarm system going off, telling us something is not right. I akin this to those early days of grief where we're in shock, we're having to make all these really big decisions, we're feeling overwhelmed by what's happening. Maybe there's confusion about what happened, challenges with communication, with needs. We're in that high alert. This can be really disorienting, leading to restless nights, irritable days, and a pervasive sense of unrest. It's that state of fight or flight where every small reminder of loss might activate a strong emotional response. And then on the third level, way down at the bottom, we have dorsal vagal, which is like a withdrawal. After the intense energy of the sympathetic state, that's that middle level, our body might shift into a dorsal state where everything just slows down. We might feel really disconnected or numb, hopelessly low. It's a protective measure, almost when your cell phone battery goes into save power mode, where all of those extra functions just aren't working and we're trying to conserve energy. You might find yourself withdrawing from social activities, feeling like you have a flat affect, apathetic, lethargy, and just experiencing profound sadness. Simple tasks feel insurmountable. I refer to this as being a burrito on the couch. We're struggling with activities of daily life. We're just numb. We're not okay. So as we talk about moving up and down that nervous system ladder, those different states, knowing that there's not one right way that's going to show up and it's going to look different for everyone. And what I found, the framework allows us to have a much more nuanced perspective that recognizes the fluidity of grief and how it ebbs and flows, and beyond just the waves coming in and out. Grief doesn't cycle through predictable stages. It mirrors the unpredictability of our nervous system's response to extreme stress and loss. And I think to understand trauma, understand grief, understand ourselves as humans, it's really important that we start to move away from stage-based thinking about our grief. We cycle through these different emotional states over and over again because grief never goes away. It just gets different. When I first started working with hospice about 12 years ago, I was a counselor intern. We would get a referral. Their loved one had been on hospice, and we are given the primary contact information for who's left behind. We would reach out probably within 3 to 7 days of the initial loss event and offer information about bereavement counseling services. It's fascinating to me how visceral I remember these calls, where people weren't ready. They weren't ready to feel the pain. They were so inundated with information, decisions, stress, estate management, memorial planning, just overwhelmed in that heightened arousal, panic state. There wasn't space to think about bereavement counseling. And that's reflected in that sympathetic state. We'd usually call after 30 days, sometimes between 4 to 6 weeks. And it's almost like over time, they'd just been slowly moving down into that dorsal state. By the time we're calling at 4 to 6 weeks, it was like the air had gone out of them. They were down, they were numb, they were acutely feeling the pain of loss. And I just think that the system that was set up was because it understood how bodies respond to grief, and that shock, that initial panic activation in that sympathetic state, you're going to be there for a bit and it's exhausting. And then after that 4 to 6 week mark, the brain fog lessens a bit, the panic lessens, and we move into that dorsal state where we just hurt. We miss our person. It's painful, it's uncomfortable, it's confusing, it's disorienting, and we feel really stuck there. And I think that's where starting grief counseling can be really helpful. Utilizing therapy resources to start moving between those 3 levels, those 3 states, because we're just going to keep cycling through them up and down that ladder. I think about the dual processing model for grief, and we talk about oscillating between grief work and restorative work. And when I think about that, I think of moving down that ladder. With some of my clients, I use the metaphor of deep sea diving. When we have that initial loss event, we're just treading water. We're suddenly in the middle of the ocean, we're treading water. Oh my gosh, what do I do? And then as the reality sets in, it's almost like we're sinking just down where the anglerfish go. It's dark and cold and lonely and painful and disorienting. We can't just stay down there. We have to find a way to come back up for air. And that's how that dual processing model of grief shows up, is oscillating between the deep dive down into the depths, into that dorsal space, doing grief work, and then learning how to come back up for air, moving through the sympathetic state and up to the ventral state where we're connecting, able to be social, creative, or do work or adulty things, doing life-giving things that are taking care of us. And so it's learning how to navigate moving up and down that ladder between the dorsal and the ventral, usually landing somewhere on sympathetic in the middle. And I think that's such a powerful visual for grief work that I had to share. As we recognize these different states and the fluidity between those three states, over time, we figure out how to be more compassionate and understanding towards ourselves as we navigate those states, doing the oscillation between the grief work and the restorative work. That it helps us see that fluctuations are normal, that when we have off days, off moments, it's a natural response to the profound loss we're experiencing, the disruption, the response to the life event we didn't choose. As we figure out how our body handles grief, I think that's why I love the 3 ladder prong and then pairing that with the dual processing model. So we're learning how to navigate and respond to our unique grief in a non-linear way, because there's nothing linear about grief. It's this complex interplay of emotion and physiological response that can vary day by day, even moment by moment, breath by breath. It's important to recognize that we're going to have secondary losses. I call them the ripples, because we have that primary loss event, and then it's almost like throwing a rock in a lake and the ripples out afterwards. They're still happening. Talking about the secondary ripples out from that primary loss event. They're not just about the person we lost, but the way that we're missing them in our future events, at milestones, graduations, weddings, births, anniversaries, or even just simple daily routines that we shared, like missing them in the tiny moments. And when we're in those states, grief bursts can happen. They're like those sneak attack waves that just snag us out of nowhere. We hadn't braced for impact. They weren't predictable. It's like you're wandering through the grocery store and you grab a yogurt and somehow that reminds you of your person. And now you're falling apart and you have to leave your basket of groceries because you can't do anything. You can't adult. You need to just leave. And that's really hard. I think that's where our desire for some kind of linear process comes from. However, it doesn't serve us because there isn't a beginning, a middle, and an end for growth. I think it's important to move away from that belief and again move forward into a more modern body informed perspective of grief, and understanding that our nervous system is trying to tell us something when we move into those different states that we're feeling activated by a smell, a memory, a holiday, an anniversary. What do those parts of us need when we are suffering? Quick shout out to episode 2 where we talk about common grief reactions. There is a really helpful little handout listing all of our common grief reactions on that. And I think that can help us start to understand the ebb and flow of moving through the different grief states. And I think recognizing patterns within ourselves, whether it's seasonal changes, whether it's certain months that are harder because that was our loved one's birthday or that's the anniversary of their passing, knowing that there's going to be extra activation certain times of year. And so really leaning into our tools, because it's, again, like grief doesn't go away. Grief is really inconvenient. It doesn't hit us when we're predicting it. Sometimes it does, but often it's more like a smell, a memory, a sound. It can link us back to a different time. So in thinking about navigating grief states and moving forward with this integrated perspective on how we're processing and doing grief, becomes less about achieving a state of acceptance and more about integration and adaptation. So how do we integrate these experiences and continue to find meaning? I love meaning making. Robert Niemeyer does this great job of talking about how do we say hello again in a new way, which I just love. Meaning making is going to be unique to you and the person that you lost. It's about finding creative ways to carry them with us as we keep moving forward, whether that's rituals, lighting candles, empty chairs at the table, memorial jewelry, memorial tattoos, listening to music that makes us think of them, just talking to them even. Like maybe you write them a letter once a year on the anniversary of their passing, or you keep their phone number going and you call and leave a voice message for them on their birthdays. Whatever's going to bring you comfort in those continuing bonds is important, and it helps make meaning for us moving forward by weaving the memory of our loved ones into our day-to-day lives. As we wrap up today's episode, I know I probably threw a lot of big words, but just remembering that our nervous system has 3 states. We have the ventral vagal, which is where we're able to connect, create, and be social. We have the sympathetic state, where that's our call to mobilize. We're in that fight or flight response. We're anxious or angry, irritable, busy energy. And then we have the dorsal vagal, which is call to immobilization, flat affect, burrito on the couch, not moving. And we move through those 3 states while we're grieving through the rest of our lives. So I think remembering that there's no timeline for when we should be quote unquote over it. I hate that language. It's not something to get over or get through. It's just something to learn to carry, because again, our grief doesn't go away. It's not about reaching a state of acceptance. It's about integrating our loss into our lives and learning how to carry our memories of our person forward while acknowledging the ongoing impact of our loss. I'd really like to remind listeners that even while grief can feel isolating, you're not alone. We don't have to be alone in our grief. We might want to be alone sometimes if we're feeling really big feelings, and that's okay too. You're allowed to let your grief take up space and to share about it. Reach out, connect, support those around you, check in with people, say their person's name. Invite yourself into that grief space with them. Like, you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to tell them it's going to get better, because we can't guarantee it's going to get better. We can just talk about how it's going to get different. I think that's important to remember. Platitudes tend to minimize and make us feel like you're not someone we can lean into. And it's better to just say, that sucks. I'm sorry that you're having such a hard time right now. I'm here with you in it. I see you. I see that you're hurting. Just normalize talking about the pain of our grief, because it's not going to go away. It's just going to get different. I just encourage you to be kind to yourselves today and know that you're doing a great job. Remember, there's no right or wrong way to grieve, and there's no set timeline for healing. You're doing a great job just by being here, engaging with these difficult and important conversations. And I look forward to continuing this journey with you next time. So until then, take care of yourself and each other. That's all for today's episode of Grief is the New Normal. If today's conversation resonated with you, I invite you to share it with someone who might need it. And if you're looking for more support or resources, feel free to head over to The Morning Movement, where we continue to build community and normalize these hard, beautiful parts of life. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, and until next time, be kind to yourself. Opening and closing music is provided by the Datacorns. If you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, collaboration, or training opportunities, feel free to email me at hello@griefisthenewnormal.com. And podcasts are also now available streaming on YouTube.